And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing again next system bringing rain into the southwest coast and spreading eastward there across Kuskokwim Valley. Areas of precipitation northward there to the western Arctic coast. Next system down here, more rain and a little bit of an increase in the wind, but nothing serious here coming into the eastern Aleutians. And this system in the Gulf, a little stronger, bringing gale and storm force winds with it here, especially in the offshore areas tonight. The front moving late tonight into southeast interior. Rain heavy at times from Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, down into the Panhandle, again with gale force winds there as well. Dry up over the eastern and northeast interior. And for tomorrow, rain all the way up to the Brooks Range, extending down into the south central Alaska area, especially the North Gulf Coast and then the Panhandle. Rain heavy at times there. Another front here approaching the area with another low farther to the south there. And this system kind of slowly moving inland, and the front weakening, keeping it wet over the western interior as this low tracks east-southeastward there toward the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Friday, next system here developing over the east central Aleutian areas will spread rain into the Fox Islands. Weak low pressure here to the north keeps it wet and unsettled over much of the western interior in toward the central areas and even the North Slope and Arctic coast. On Friday looking a little damper than they have been, and kind of a break here for the Panhandle, especially early on with some high pressure building, and especially in the south there. Next system building here southeast of Kodiak Island. Now be swinging on up Friday night into Saturday. Coastal water forecast, gale warnings on the south coast of the Panhandle tonight for 35-knot winds from the south with 16-foot seas. Small craft advisories for the north coast. South to east winds, 25 to 35 knots. South 35 with higher gusts, or south 30 knots with higher gusts there for Lynn Canal. South 25 with higher gusts for Stevens Passage, and south 30 knots for Clarence Strait. Seas at about 8 feet. And for Friday, south coast here, south winds 20 knots. Central coast, south to southeast at 20 to 25 knots on the north coast. Strongest winds there again. Southeast to east at 25 to 30 knots with 8-foot seas. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots. Stevens Passage, south winds 20 knots. And Clarence Strait, southeast at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Prince William Sound for the day on Thursday, northeast winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. And east to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, seas 11 feet. North 25 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, northwest winds 25 knots. East or west winds at 20 knots for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, northwest winds 10 to 20 knots with 2 to 4 foot seas. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. East winds 25 knots for both Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast for east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots and east to 20 for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots Thursday. And the Alaska Peninsula here, southwest at 15 to 20 knots with 20-knot southwest winds in the forecast for Bristol Bay. And for Friday, west winds 10 to 15 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, west at 15 also for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island. And the surrounding waters, east-northeast at 20 knots with 5 to 7 foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, south to west winds 15 to 20 knots for Thursday. Adak and Atka, west-southwest 20 to 25 knots. And small craft advisories for the western Aleutians for west to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Friday, western Aleutians, lighter winds there out of the west-northwest down to 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka, west winds 15 knots, 5 to 7 foot seas. And eastern Aleutians, west winds at 20 knots. For the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, tomorrow, south winds at 15 knots. Yukon Delta Coast, west winds at 10 knots. St. Lawrence Island, east winds at 10 knots. And the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, variable winds at 10 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. Outlook for Friday, west winds at 15 knots for the Pribilofs, northwest 20 for St. Matthew Island, southwest 20 here for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. And for Yukon Delta Coast, west at 10, east at 10 for St. Lawrence Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea Coast tomorrow, east winds 15 knots, southeast at 10 for the Central Coast, western coast, east at 10, and the Chukchi Sea, light east-southeast winds at about 10 knots, seas no more than 2 feet. And then for Friday, Chuck TC, 10-knot winds here, up to 25 there around Cape Lisburne and Point Hope out of the northeast. Western Arctic coast, east at 20 knots. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coastlines, east-northeast winds at 15 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas.